Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Gretchen and today I am here with another reading recap. So we have passed the Christmas holiday and over that time I had a good bit of time to catch up on a lot of reading. So there are several books that I have finished since last we chatted on one of these videos. So I'll go ahead and cover those, and then I'm actively reading two books that we'll talk about that I'm going to try to get to before the end of the year. And we'll talk a little bit toward the end about what my upcoming video schedule might look like and what type of videos you should be expecting from me soon. So let's go ahead and jump right into the books. So the first book that I want to talk about is a book called The Most by Jessica Anthony. Now, this is a short little book. This was a book that was longlisted for the National Book Award, and I had heard a lot of buzz about this book. A lot of people were talking about it and about how much they enjoyed it, and I'm so glad that I picked this one up. This is a small but mighty kind of read. Basically, it's set in, I think, the late 50s or the early 60s, if I'm remembering correctly, but it follows this woman. Her and her husband have recently moved to a different state with their two young boys, and they're temporarily residing in this apartment complex until they, get settled and they find a more permanent home. And one day, it's in November and it's an unseasonably warm day, the family is getting ready to go to church, and the mom, who is going through some things, and we slowly learn about those things throughout the duration of the story, she basically decides that she is not going to go, and instead she is going to go swimming in the pool at the apartment complex. And she has a couple obstacles that she has to get through in order to get into the pool because it's winter and it's closed, and she eventually does, and the rest of the book is basically her trying to be coaxed out of the water to get back to her life with her boys and her husband, and she is quite content with just remaining in the pool. And she stays in there for several hours, and I know that that doesn't sound like a very interesting premise, but the way that the story unfolds, it's not just about her being in the pool, it's about us learning about all of the things that are going on in her life that led her to such a chaotic act, or such an act that is so outside of what her family and the people in her lives would normally expect from her. So I really loved this story. I loved how messy it was. We learn about what's going on in her life. We learn about what's going on in her husband's life. We learn about her life in general from the time that she was young and things that passed that she maybe regretted not going forward with, or maybe things that she did regret doing. And it was, once again, a very short novel, but it's one of those that packs a lot into it. It's very dense in its themes and its meanings, and it was a super quick read for me. I read it in one sitting on a Saturday afternoon, and I enjoyed every minute of this book. And it's not necessarily a book that is plot heavy. It's more about learning about these characters and what's going on in their lives. But if you know anything about me in this channel, I love that messy family internal dynamics, and this book definitely fit the bill for that. The next book that I want to talk about is The Empusium Empusium by Olga Tokarczuk, and this is translated from the Polish by Antonia Lloyd Jones. Now, this book I had on my radar anyway. I was going to read it regardless, but it just so happened to be the book club pick, or one of the last book club picks for Scott over at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot's Patreon book club. So I read this book for that, but I'm really glad that I did because I have yet to read anything by Olga Tokarczuk, and this is something that I've been wanting to do for a really long time. And the premise of this book sounded very interesting to me. So this book supposedly is a nod to The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. Now, that is not a book that I have ever read, so I can't confirm or deny that, but I will say that I don't think that that is a book that you have to have read prior to reading this. This book will definitely stand alone, but if you have read The Magic Mountain, this book may feel slightly familiar in some of its thematic elements. So this book takes place right before the start of World War I in a place that is today a part of Western Poland. And we have a young man, his name is Voynich, and he suffers from tuberculosis, and there is this health resort that he goes to try to cure his ailments, and it's a place where a lot of other men go to. Now, the actual health resort is not where he is staying. He is staying in a place that's kind of, for lack of a better term, it's kind of like off campus per se. So it's close to it, but it's not quite in the actual health resort, but it's in this secluded area and it's surrounded by woods, and there are supposedly a lot of weird, kind of ominous and unknown things that are going on in the woods around him. So that's kind of a backdrop of the story. You have this slight element of horror, and that is one thing I will say about the book, is that it does claim in its subtitle to be a horror story, and I don't necessarily feel like there's that level of horror to it, but there is a little bit, and it comes from the kind of looming dread that revolves around these woods that lie outside of this health resort area. Now, the main part of the book, and the book is not really plot heavy either. It's more about the characters, and it's also about the themes and the discussions that the men that are in this health resort are having. So I think this is where that nod to The Magic Mountain comes in. These men gather and they have a ton of these deep, meaningful, philosophical conversations about the state of the world and all of the things that are hot topics for them at the moment. And I think that's the real gem of this story, and that's really where I felt myself being invested in the story, is hearing all of these conversations and kind of being a fly on the wall to the conversations that these men were having. And this is a very feminist book in the sense that these men get together and they have just the most horrible conversations about women and how we have no place or purpose in this world other than to be there for them whenever we are needed. And I love the fact that this book came from a woman and her perspective, and basically it almost felt like satire to me as I was reading it, because she is talking about all of these conversations and these men are just saying horrible things, but they're all true and they're all things that were a part of the ideals of the time, and not just of the time, but ideas that we still have to tackle today as far as a woman's place and a woman's worth in the greater society. So I just thought that this book was very clever. I thought that it was well constructed. I thought that even though this book didn't have much of a plot, it still had enough to keep me going. There is also an element of mystery in here as well. There are some unexplained deaths, and there is kind of that little plot that's, you know, a part of an undercurrent of the book, but it's not what is driving the book. I have never, as I mentioned, read anything by Olga Tokarczuk before, so I don't have anything to compare it to, but I am intrigued by her writing style. I find her writing to be very purposeful and sparse, and I didn't find it excessively fluffy or padded, and I just really liked her delivery and the tone that she set for this book. Now, this is definitely not going to be a book that everybody gets along with, and if you do decide to pick this up, I would urge you to take this book slowly. I am actually considering a reread myself. Having the book club discussion with Scott's group, there were things that I realized that I missed and that I didn't pick up on initially, and hearing other people point those things out, it really made me think about how maybe I approached that book with maybe a little too much force, and I, you know, kind of sped through it. Not sped through it, but I read it way faster than it was probably intended to be read. So if you do decide to tackle this one, I would suggest just maybe taking your time and kind of savoring it. And I think if you do that, you're going to have a much better experience than if you just kind of try to fly through it. So yeah, I am definitely happy that I read this one, and also in having the discussion with the other people in the book club, it's made me want to read her backlist all the more. So I'm really looking forward to picking up more from her in the years to come. All right, so let's move on to the physical books that I have finished, that I still have. The next one I want to talk about is The Snow Child by Eowyn Ivey, and this is a book that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. I can't remember the year. I think it was 2011, but please don't quote me on that. But I knew about this book for a long time. It was on my radar for a long time, and this is a book that I obviously wanted to read in the winter. It is set in Alaska in the 1920s, so I wanted to make sure that I was kind of feeling in the wintry mood whenever I picked this book up. And I was lucky enough that we had some very snowy days over the past week or so where I live in Pittsburgh, and it was an absolute delight to read it during that time because this book is very atmospheric. It is a story that follows a couple, Jack and Mabel, and they moved to Alaska. They are from Pennsylvania originally, and I'm from Pennsylvania, so that also made this book all the more engaging for me. But they moved to Alaska to kind of escape their lives. They were married, and all that these two wanted was to have a family of their own, and that wasn't in the cards for them. And they internalized that, and they kind of blamed themselves, and the longer that guilt and doubt started to fester in them, they started to push each other away, and they decided that they just wanted to make a new life and a fresh start. So they picked up everything they owned and they headed to Alaska. Now, Alaska is not a kind area to move to, in the sense that Mother Nature will definitely be against you, and they struggled very much. They were trying to make ends meet, and it wasn't just about making ends meet, it was literally about surviving the winters for them. They eventually meet a couple that has a little family, and they befriend them, although Mabel is a little resistant to that. She kind of just wants to keep to herself, and she doesn't want to introduce anybody else into her life. And they are visiting them, and then on a trip back from their home, it's snowing, and they are slowly but surely starting to get their lives back, and they're starting to, you know, get their marriage back on track. And one night as they are traveling home, it starts to snow, and they decide on a whim that they are going to build a snowman. And Mabel decides not just a snowman, but they wanted to build a little girl. And once the snow girl was built, Jack carved a little face in it, and they put a little scarf and mittens on it, and they then go home. Well, the next day they notice that the scarf and the mittens are gone, and the snowman has been destroyed, and there's footprints that are leading away from the snowman, but there's no footprints that are leading to it. So I can't remember if it's a couple days later or a couple weeks later, they notice from the kind of corner of their eyes that they see something dashing through the woods, which looks like a little girl. They realize that it is a real girl, and even though their friends think that they are kind of crazy and delulu, because that just doesn't make any sense, and they're, you know, in Alaska, and you can kind of get cabin fever and hallucinate and things like that, they know in their hearts that she is real. And this little girl, her name is Faina, comes into their life and brings them together. And I won't give any more of the story away because there is a lot more to the plot than that. And I will say I loved this book. I thought this was so quaint and charming, and it was one of those books that will melt your heart in a good way, but then it will just tear you down, because it's a book that's filled with really happy times. It's a book that's filled with really sad times, and there's just something magical about it. There's also this thread throughout the book where Mabel has a copy of a fairy tale called The Snow Child, and it lends that mythical and magical element to this book. And yeah, I really enjoyed my time with this. As I mentioned before, it's very atmospheric, and it will be a fast read. I was very much engaged with this story. It was a book that I didn't want to put down because I was so invested in these characters. And another reason why I picked this book up around this time was this author has a new book coming out in January called Blackwood's Blue Sky. So I wanted to make sure that I got to this one before that one came out, because I have had this on my TBR forever, and I honestly should have read it years ago, but I wanted to make sure before I pick the next one up that I have read this one. So I highly recommend this. It's a perfect book for this time of year, and yeah, I absolutely loved this one. So the next book that I want to talk about is Mrs. Caliban by Rachel Ingalls, and this is a book that is short, but it was delightful, and it's kind of weird, and I really like weird books, and this definitely fit the bill for weird. Now, this book takes place in the late 50s. It follows our main character, Dorothy, and she is a bored and lonely housewife, and the story starts with her at home cooking dinner, doing all of her chores, waiting for her husband to get home, and there's an announcement that comes on the radio that there is this monster that has recently escaped from this Institute for Oceanographic Research. Now there's this half-man, half-sea creature monster that is on the loose, and wouldn't you know, he goes to Dorothy's house and she comes face to face with this monster. her. And very shortly after she discovers him, they have this strong chemistry, and they very quickly start engaging in this sexual affair. And I know that that sounds like a very weird premise, and it is, but the book is about so much more than her having sex with this sea monster. She lives a very lonely life. She has had a lot of tragedy in her life, and as we learn more about this relationship that she's having with this sea monster who goes by the name of Larry, which just cracks me up. But the more we learn about her affair with Larry, the more we learn about her past and her relationship with her husband, and how all is not as it seems with that. And then she also has this complicated relationship with some friends in her life. And yeah, it's a book that on the surface is just kind of this campy story about an affair with a sea monster, but under the surface of that, it's really touching, it's really heartwarming, and there's a lot of humanity in this story. She's faced with a lot of ethical dilemmas, questions that she has to answer, you know, internally about herself and what kind of person she is. And yeah, I really enjoyed my time with this. This is one of those books that was kind of lost. It was out of publication for a while, and it just kind of went by the wayside. And I love that some of these indie publishers out there are trying to resurrect these old stories and bring them back to life. And this is published by New Directions, and I just love the idea of these hidden gems from the 80s and the 70s and the 60s are all coming back into the reading world, and we now have easier access to really unique and fun stories like this. If you don't mind a little absurdity with your stories, if you like weird books, I think that this would be one that you would like as well. The next book that I want to talk about is A Trace of Sun by Pam Williams. Now, this is a book that was longlisted for this year's Women's Prize for Fiction, and sadly, this book took me forever to read. I just kept getting distracted. I kept picking it up. I kept putting it down. And there's really no reason, because this book is fabulous. I loved this book. So this book takes place over the lifetime of a young man. It goes from him being a young boy in Granada to him being a full-grown adult in the UK. So basically, the book starts with him as a youth in Granada with his family. He had a mom and a dad and a brother, and the family decides that they are going to leave Granada to start a new, better life in the UK. But the problem is that they don't have enough money for everyone to go. So they leave Rafe behind with his aunt, and they move the rest of the family to the UK. And then when they get there, they realize that the mom, Scylla, is pregnant with a sister, and that complicates things because they were hoping to get Rafe over sooner, but now they have this new baby, and that costs a lot of money. So it is actually several years before they are able to get Rafe to the UK. So Rafe has been living with his aunt in Granada, and he's basically started his new life without his family. And it happened when he was a young boy. I think he was 7 when they left. So he really experienced a lot of time away from his family. And then he moves to the UK, and he has to get reacquainted with his mom and his dad and his brother. But now the dynamic has even changed more because he has this sister in the mix as well. So he goes there, he doesn't feel like he fits in. There's a lot of dynamics going on there. And you can only imagine how that would impact the mental health of such a young, impressionable boy. Once he gets over to the UK, there are some things that start to happen, and there is an eventual event that occurs, which I will not talk about for spoilers, but it changes the course of everything within this family, and it drives a wedge between them. And eventually we have Rafe isolating himself from the family. He's no longer talking to them, and he has basically cut his family out of his life. Now, Scylla doesn't want that to happen. She loves her son, and she wants the family to be together, and she just wants everything to be the way that she always imagined it would be. But there's too much damage that has been done, and it just doesn't look like it's in the cards. So the rest of the book is about that event that happened and the way that Rafe is dealing with that, and the dynamic of the family trying to get back on track with everything that has happened. And there are so many little twists and turns throughout this book. It is so good. It's so propulsive. And I say that fully knowing that it took me a long time to read this, but I just, like I said, I can't explain it. This book had so many moments where I was just like, I can't believe that just happened. And it was written so well, and I loved the way that the author wrote the characters. This is actually based on the author's real life. I don't know exactly all of the specifics about what is true versus what is fiction, but yeah, it was such a fantastic book. This book had everything that I look for in a piece of fiction. It had a great plot, it had great characters, it had twists and turns, it was well written. I highly recommend it. I don't even know if this book is readily available in the States. I did have to get my copy from the UK, so I don't know if it's one of those books that we'll eventually see here, but if you can get your hands on a copy of this, I do really recommend it. It is a great family dynamic story, and I loved it from start to finish. So the next book that I want to talk about is a book called Winter in Sokcho, and this is by Elisa Shua Dusapin, and this is translated from the French by Aneesa Abbas Higgins. So this book is one that I went into it not really expecting a whole lot. I read this for the Reindeer Readathon. It has been on my TBR forever, and I thought, you know what, it is finally time to just get it read. And I was not expecting this book to hit me as hard as it did. This is one of those books, when I see short little books like this, I never really go into them expecting too much. I don't necessarily feel like there's a whole lot that's going to happen. Like nothing is going to be fleshed out enough for me to connect with the book when it's as short as it is. And I could not have been more wrong with this book. It hit me very hard. It's quiet, and it's one of those books that has so much that it left unsaid, and it allows the readers to fill in all of the blanks. And it was atmospheric. It is set in winter, so it was another book that I read over that cold, snowy stretch that we recently had, and I think that added a lot to my reading experience with this. It follows a young woman, and she lives in Sokcho, which is a South Korean beach town, and during the winter months everything kind of shuts down, and there's not a lot of activity. She works at this little hotel, so during the non-tourist months things are usually pretty slow and unexciting, and there is this guest that shows up. He is French and he is a graphic novelist, and he has traveled to Sokcho to get inspiration for his next book and his character. And he really wants to see what life is like from the perspective of a resident. So he wants to immerse himself in that. And when he gets there and he encounters this young woman, she's a university student, so she's fairly young, and he is older. They get off to kind of a rough start, and very slowly as the book progresses, they start to develop this connection with each other. And she is at a point in her life where she really doesn't know what she wants to do with her life. She's kind of questioning whether or not she wants to leave Sokcho. If she does, she'll have to leave her mother behind, but her mother is in a place where she really needs the support still, and she doesn't feel comfortable with moving away. She does have a boyfriend. He is a model and he travels a lot, and he is encouraging her to move to Seoul, but she is just not really sure where her life is going or what she wants to do with it. So she is kind of at a crossroads, and this mysterious stranger comes into her life, and she is just kind of letting her guard down and letting her emotions and her feelings guide her through the time that she is spending with this man. And this book is compact, but the narrative is so emotionally charged, and it had me sucked in from the beginning. Every sentence in this book has a purpose. There is not a wasted word, and it was sparse, but it oozed tension and heart. I loved it. There's a quiet bleakness and barrenness to it because of the setting, and the fact that it's in winter. So I loved that atmospheric element to it. I found it to be extremely touching. You have this protagonist that's longing for multiple things in her life, but she just doesn't know how to get those, or if they're even possible, or even if she deserves them. She's longing for love and physical and emotional connections, and most importantly, she's longing for freedom. She has all of these duties that are holding her back. She has a tenuous relationship with her father that she never knew, so she questions all of that. I forgot to mention that she is half Korean, half French. Her father was French, so there's that connection between this man being French and her father being French, and she's longing for a connection to her homeland, you know, the other part of the world where she is from, and she is finding it in this man. She longs for safety in her home. There's a part of this book where, it being set in South Korea, one of the places that she takes him to is the border between the South and the North, where she shows him that they are under constant threat with all of the weapons that are being pointed directly at them, and how, you know, at any moment their livelihoods could be threatened, or the fact that they are constantly at risk of war. And even though I was emotionally invested with this book from very early on, it still snuck up on me. I had no idea how truly invested I was until the ending, and I'm not gonna lie, tears were shed. I did not come out of this book unscathed, and I think that it's going to be a book that sticks with me. I'm going to remember my experience with this book, and it's going to be one of those books that the atmosphere and the feeling and the emotion of this story is going to be one of those books that just lingers and haunts me. So yeah, I am so glad I finally picked this up off of my TBR. So let this be a lesson to you. For those books that are just rotting away on your TBR, pick one of them up and see if you connect with it, because it might be a really great read for you. The next book that I finished is Intermezzo by Sally Rooney, and if you follow my channel at all, you know this is one of my anticipated reads of the year. I knew that I had to read this the second I knew that it was coming out, and once again, Sally Rooney did not disappoint me. I really enjoyed my time with this book. Normal People is still my favorite, but this was a close second. I love this book because it follows brothers. I don't think we get enough books about brother dynamics, and I was really pleased that this one did follow brothers. We have Peter. He is the older brother. He's in his mid-30s, and he is a lawyer, so he kind of has his life together, financially at least, but his love life is pretty complicated. He is currently in the midst of some situationships with two women. He still holds a candle for his first love, Sylvia, and Sylvia and him are no longer together. Sylvia has had an accident, and that kind of took its toll on their relationship, and he is no longer with her, but they're still very close, and he spends a lot of time with her. And then he has Naomi. Naomi is very young. She is in her early 20s, and she is a student, and she is not financially stable. I don't even think she has a job, and he's basically kind of her sugar daddy, and it seems like their relationship is more about lust than the relationship that he has with Sylvia, which is definitely more based on love. And then we have his younger brother, Ivan. Ivan is a chess genius, and he is in his early 20s as well, and we have him getting involved with an older woman, and the dynamics between him and this older woman, Margaret, are interesting because Margaret is coming off of a marriage, and Ivan has not really had a whole lot of experience with women, but he has this connection with Margaret, and everything seems to be going really well, but there's a little bit of a fight or an argument between Peter and Ivan because Peter is concerned because of the age gap between him and Margaret, but that's being really hypocritical because of his relationship that he has with Naomi. So there's a lot of messiness going on in this book, and it's all set under the backdrop of them, the two brothers, recently losing their father. So this book focuses on grief and how we handle grief and how we self-sabotage and how we have good intentions, but we end up doing the exact opposite of what we know is right. And there's just so much messiness, and the way that Sally Rooney writes is it's not fictionalized messiness. This is all relatable stuff. These are things that we all experience it to some level. I'm not saying this exact situation, but we all know somebody in our lives that has gone through the loss of a parent. We all know somebody in our lives that has had that May-December kind of romance. We all know a set of brothers that have fought because of a woman, you know, and the way that she presents it and the way that she writes these stories is just so human, and it's so real. And I think that that's why I love her writing so much. It doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel like anything that is being made up for the purposes of entertainment. Her dialogue is spot on. It feels like normal conversations that you would be having with someone, and I think that that's why I relate to her book so much, is they just feel so real. And yeah, if you are at all a Sally Rooney fan from any of her other books, I think you're going to enjoy this one as well, and I can't wait for her next one to come out. She usually does, I think, 2-year breaks between her books, so it's gonna be a while, but yeah, I am definitely glad that I picked this one up. And the next book that I want to talk about is, I finally finished Les Mis. I finished this brick of a book. I am so proud of myself. It is over 1,300 pages. And let me tell you, I felt this book. I felt every single page. Now, I will preface this by saying I'm a huge fan of the story of Les Mis as far as the musical. So going into this, I was very familiar with the basic plot line. Now, obviously, the musical and the movie are not going to capture everything that is in this giant tome, but the basic structure is there. But what the book does is it not only fills in the gaps with the story, so we do get a little more of the character development and the story. It inserts a ton of history into the book as well. And normally when I'm reading a book, I absolutely love learning and I love being prompted to go out and learn more on my own and kind of do my own research outside of the story. But this book was different because I feel like most of what you needed was included in the story. And unfortunately, I know this sounds crazy, but it bogged the story down for me. Even though normally when I'm reading a book that has a lot of historical context to it, I will stop reading and I'll go and do my own little research, and then I'll come back to the book and I'll tell you how much I loved the book because it forced me to do that. But being presented with the history in full and very in depth as part of the actual text, I found to be very much a slog. I felt like I didn't have a chance to take a break from the book, and it totally distracted me from the story completely. So this book, what it does is, I think it's separated into like 8 separate distinct sections, but each of those sections comes with several pages. I mean, some of them were like 30 to 50 pages of just straight up historical narrative, talking about all of the French history during this time. And like I said, normally I would be fine with that, but we were getting so much detail, and Hugo set up everything about the story, and I feel like it was just too much. He provided too much information, way more than what is necessary to enjoy the story of Les Mis. And I know that part of the appeal of Les Mis is to know that history, and that's fine, and I respect the fact that he put that in here. But like I said, I personally like to do a lot of that research on my own, and I like to take my time with it. But being forced to read through it to get to the next part of the plot, it was very much a challenge for me. So did I appreciate this book? Absolutely, 100%. The plot, if you take all of those historical chapters out, the plot of this book is fantastic. It is exciting, it is engaging, but what I would suggest, if you really do pride yourself on needing to know every aspect of the historical side of a book, you're going to want to read the unabridged version and you'll get more out of it. But if you really want to focus on the plot and the story and do your own research on the historical side, go for the abridged version. I feel like you're gonna, if you're like me at all, you would enjoy your time with the abridged version much better. And I was a trooper. Like, I read this, so interesting fact, Les Mis is set up with exactly 365 chapters. So if you break down all of the different books and all of the different sections, there are 365 separate chapters, which is really great because you can read this in a year. And I started out by reading a chapter a day, and I really liked that, but it did get a little bit away from me. And because I was doing a lot of because I did the unabridged version and I was reading a lot of those historical chapters, the first time I got to one of those really dense historical sections, it almost killed me. So then I decided that I was going to read it more. I was going to kind of get away from that reading a chapter a day and then just read it till I felt like I was comfortable with moving on to the next section. But certainly if you want to take the chapter a day approach, that might be good for you. But like I said, having to read those really dense historical chapters really did me in on those daily reads. The other thing is that even with all of the history, it was just too much. There were too many times when we talked about one thing for 30 pages that could have very easily been summed up in 2 or 3, 5 at the most. For example, there's this section of the book when we get toward the end and there is a wedding, and then we have this super pervy kind of grandpa talking to the husband and the wife about how important marriage is and how important it is to be there for each other and to enjoy the freedoms of your marriage and the intimate relations of the marriage. And he was giving like this wedding speech, and this wedding speech in the book, it was like 15 pages long. I am not even kidding. 15 some pages long. It may even have been longer. And I'm like, this is supposed to be a wedding speech? Like, in what world is it acceptable or realistic or logical to have somebody just wax poetic for 15 pages about marriage? I couldn't. But I don't want that to take away from the actual story. The actual story, like I said, is intriguing, it's engaging. If it hadn't been for the history, I feel like it would have been super fast paced. I would never read this again, and if I did, I would certainly be doing the abridged version. But am I glad I read it? 100%. Do I think that this book has its deserved space in literary history? 100%. But was it a slog? Yeah, it was a slog. I'm not gonna lie. I can't deny that, but I am so glad that I read it, and I'm so glad that it's over, and I can move on to my next giant read for 2025, which I think is going to be War and Peace. So I heard that one is going to be a much easier, probably more digestible read, but yeah, I am so proud of myself. I did it. So the last book that I want to talk about is Jonathan Strange and Mr Nol by Susanna Clarke. And this is a book that I started way back in autumn. It's a very thick and chunky book, and when I started it, I told myself, yeah, this book will probably take me about 5 days, maybe a week to get through. And as I started to read it, I immediately knew that that was not going to be the case. This was a book that I purposely slowed my pace down with because Susanna Clarke's writing is very dense and lush, and I wanted to make sure that I took my time with it and that I savored every page because the writing was just so beautiful and the story was so well plotted. Now, this story, for those of you that aren't familiar, it's a story about competing magicians. This book takes place in the early 1800s in a world where it is common knowledge that magic does exist. However, it hasn't been used for hundreds of years. England is in the midst of the the war with Napoleon, and they're trying to think of ways that they can ultimately come out on the other side of this war. And people start to think, well, maybe we can resurrect the use of magic. So they find that there is a practicing magician still. His name is Mr. Norrell, and Mr. Norrell proves to this group of men that he in fact can do magic, and he successfully shows them that he is capable, and they recruit him to help defeat the French. Now, also in the process, one of the ways that he proves to them that he can do magic is he basically resurrects someone, a young woman from the dead. While all of this is happening, word comes about that there is another magician out there, and his name is Jonathan Strange. Now, Jonathan Strange is kind of the opposite of Mr. Norrell in the sense that he is much younger. Mr. Norrell is kind of stuffy, and Jonathan Strange is just kind of more charismatic, and word gets around that he can do magic too, and Mr. Norrell feels a little threatened, so he eventually agrees to take him under his wing and train Jonathan Strange as a pupil. And then eventually Jonathan Strange is recruited to also help with the war effort. As Jonathan Strange starts to learn more and more about magic, he starts to become more obsessed about the origins of magic, and basically it takes him down a path. And I won't give any more of the story away, but eventually the Mr. Norrell's way of magic and Jonathan Strange's way of magic basically comes to blows. And that's all that I will say about the plot. I don't want to give any more away or anything that would be a spoiler, but I really did enjoy my time with this book. And this is a book that if you do enjoy reading books that are fantastical and magical, this is going to be a book right up your alley, and more so if you want to see that from the literary side. Now, the way that this book made me feel, it kind of did really conjure up those memories for me of how I felt when I read Harry Potter for the first time. So that awe of being in a magical world, but this is more adult. And when I say adult, I don't mean lascivious, I mean more in a literary respect. So when I obviously read Harry Potter, those are meant for, you know, younger audiences. So the language is much more juvenile. This is magic, but it is all literary, and it's beautifully written, and it's so imaginative, and it paints such a vivid picture. And one thing too about this book that I absolutely loved, I recommend making sure you read a physical copy, because as with most Susanna Clarke books, she provides the most beautiful illustrations throughout the duration of the book, which really paints a great picture as well. I love any time that there are books that have illustrations throughout them. But yeah, there was just something very quaint to this book. Even though it had, you know, harsh themes, there was a coziness about it. This was a very engrossing read, and it's one that I was forced to use my imagination with, and I love doing that as an adult. It's just something that really tapped into my inner child. So I did really enjoy my time with this book. One thing I will say is that it is very long, as I mentioned, but it could have probably been edited down some, but I don't think that I would have liked it as much as if it were. I feel like a lot of the extra things that Susanna Clarke included added to its charm, and it's a book that as I was reading, I kept thinking, yeah, like I want to get to the end. Like I want to know what happens. I want to know what happens. But then once I got to the end, I felt kind of sad that it was over. And I was like, well, wait, yeah, I could actually do with another 100 pages. She's just such a good writer. So I know that there are probably readers out there that would complain about the length, but I was really enjoying my time with it, and I just loved her writing style. So the more of that, the better. So I actually looked at it as more of a positive than a negative. So I am so glad I finally got to this one. This is another book that has been on my TBR for a very long time, and I am really glad that I finally did end up picking this one up. Also, I have a question for all of you guys out there. I heard that there is an adaptation of this, but is it worth, if any of you out there have seen it, is it worth a watch? Is it going to ruin the book for me if I dabble into that? I'm just really curious because I would love to see this visually, and curious too if not only do the visuals match up, but does it kind of stay true to the story. So yeah, I'm so glad that through this last kind of final stretch of reading through the end of the year that I was able to read so many good books. So I am still actively reading 2 books that should be done by the end of the year. The Road to the Salt Sea by Samuel Kolawole, and the second is The Life Impossible by Matt Haig. And as far as those 2 books, I should get them done, and I will start fresh with a new book starting on New Year's Day. So as far as videos that I still have to do that are upcoming, I wanted to make sure that I read all of my books for 2024 before I decided what my favorites were. I have the list together. I am in the process of ordering them, which is proving to be very difficult. So I should have my best of 2024 video out coming sometime the first week of January. I also plan on doing a most disappointing reads of 2024, and then I also thought it would be cool to do a video about the books that surprised me the most, kind of those sleepers that I wasn't expecting to like as much as I did. And then of course I will be doing my anticipated releases videos again. I took a break in November and December because those are really light publishing months, and there really wasn't a whole lot that I wanted to talk about that came out during those months, so I just took a break from those to do other things. But those will be coming out again, and of course I will still continue to do these reading recaps. So there will also be a video to talk about my reading goals for 2025, which I've been kicking around some ideas as far as my reading habits, and also some new video ideas that I have for my channel, and I'm really looking forward to sharing those with you. So until we read again, which will be in 2025, bye!